I don't know why this happened.
She fainted at the party. She woke up in a stranger's arms. Deep voice, dark suit, the scent of something she couldn't name. He looked at her face for one long second and said quietly, not realizing he'd said it out loud, "Mine." That same man kidnapped her, her father's debts, but she still didn't know which had been worse, the kidnapping or finding out she didn't want to leave. Chapter 1. Hours. I went because my father asked, and that's the version I repeat when someone asks, because it's easier than admitting I saw the exhaustion in his shoulders at breakfast and simply couldn't say no. 24 years old, and this man can still move me with a look. He said, "Just show up, Sky. It's important for business," in that voice of someone asking a small favor. But his eyes gave away that it wasn't small at all. So I went, in a blue dress, hair up, determined to stay exactly 2 hours and not a minute more. I didn't make it to one. The ballroom was one of those that tries to impress before you even cross the entrance, with chandeliers pouring golden light over people who knew exactly what they were worth and had no problem showing it. July heat in Manhattan doesn't respect expensive architecture, and inside was no different, with the air conditioning fighting a losing battle against the suits, the perfumes, and the champagne I drank too fast because I didn't know what to do with my hands. I circulated. I smiled at people whose names I wouldn't retain even if I tried. I checked the time 3 times in 40 minutes. Then the floor just disappeared. It wasn't dramatic. That's the detail no one imagines when you tell them. There was no movie darkness, no slow motion fall. It was just the ballroom spinning a little more than it should, and then it was the floor, and then it was nothing. And in the middle of nothing, there was something solid and warm that smelled like something I couldn't name, something between cedar and something darker, more serious, more adult than anything I associated with July gala parties. When I opened my eyes, the ceiling was wrong. The room was dark in the right way, not the darkness of an abandoned place, but the deliberate darkness of someone who chooses what comes in and what stays out. The curtains were heavy, the kind that block not just light but also sound, and the silence inside had a different quality from normal silence, as if the world outside existed in another language. I lay there for a few seconds just processing the ceiling, the pillow that wasn't mine, the comforter that weighed different, and the chair 2 meters from the bed where there was a man watching me. He had his arms crossed, and the expression of someone who'd been waiting for some time without it bothering him in the slightest. The suit was dark, the tie slightly loosened, and there was something in the way he was sitting, quiet and completely still, that said this man never occupied space by accident. Every part of him seemed positioned with an awareness most people never develop, and his eyes, dark and direct, were on me with an attention that was simultaneously evaluative and completely neutral, as if I were a problem he was still deciding how to solve. I sat up slowly, because my head still had its own opinion about the speed of things, and looked around with the calm that comes not from courage, but from a brain that hasn't fully processed the size of the situation yet. Where am I? My voice came out firmer than I expected, and part of me was grateful for that. Safe. His voice was deep and direct, the kind of voice that doesn't rise at the end of a sentence, that doesn't invite or dismiss, that just states and expects the world to adjust. That doesn't answer my question. No, he agreed. And there was something unsettling about how easily he agreed, without discomfort, without the need to explain or justify himself. It doesn't. I looked at him. He looked at me. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable the way silence with strangers usually is, which in itself was information. He was around 30. Maybe a bit more, with the kind of face that isn't handsome in the simple sense of the word, but that holds you in a way that takes time to understand why. The jaw was strong, the shoulders occupied the chair's space as if it had been made for him specifically, and there were subtle scars on his hands, the kind that don't come from cooking or sports, and that I pretended not to notice because noticing felt like a step I wasn't ready to take yet. I swung my legs out of bed with a calm that was half real and half constructed, and looked at him directly. "Are you dangerous?" Something passed across his expression, too fast to have a name, but present enough for me to register. He stayed quiet for a second, just one, and then answered with the same directness I'd used. "Yes, okay." I stood up, straightened the dress that had survived the collapse with reasonable dignity, and crossed my arms. "Then just tell me what you want so we can get this sorted out." 3 seconds. He stayed absolutely quiet for 3 full seconds, and I had the strange sense that no one had said that to this man before. Not the way I'd said it. Not with this calm. Not with this practical hurry of someone who prefers knowing to imagining. The expression didn't change exactly, but something in his eyes did, a shadow of something I couldn't classify but that seemed, strangely, like surprise. He stood up. He was tall, the kind of height you feel before processing it numerically, and moved to the window with slow, silent steps that made me understand this man had learned not to make noise at some point in his life, and that this learning had become part of how he existed in space. "There's water on the nightstand," he said, without looking at me, "and clothes in the closet if you need to change." I didn't ask for water. I asked what you want. He turned, looked at me from where he stood, on the other side of the room, and the weight of that gaze crossed the space between us with an ease that was almost physical, almost tangible, the kind of thing you feel in the center of your chest before understanding what you're feeling. "For now, I want you to sleep." "I'm not sleepy. You were unconscious 2 hours ago. That's different from sleep." The corner of his mouth moved, barely, in a movement so small I almost doubted having seen it. It wasn't a smile, it was something before a smile, something that precedes it, and that's sometimes more revealing than the smile itself, because it wasn't planned. "There's a bathroom on the right," he said. "Tomorrow I'll explain." "You're going to explain today. Sky." My name in that voice was a strange experience, because he said it without hesitating, which meant he already knew who I was before I'd said anything, and this information landed in my stomach with an uncomfortable weight. "Tomorrow." He went to the door, opened it, and stopped with one hand on the frame, his back to me, with that posture of someone who holds control of the situation without needing to demonstrate it in any specific gesture. "Are you going to try to run if I leave?" he asked, without irony, without threat, in the neutral way of someone requesting logistical information. I looked at the window, at the door, at him. "Depends on what you tell me tomorrow." This time the silence was different, longer, and when he left and the door closed with a soft, definitive click, I stood in the middle of that room that wasn't mine, in a place I didn't know, with my heart beating in the slightly wrong rhythm of someone who realizes they've entered a situation whose contours aren't clear yet. I went to the window. Outside there was an enormous garden, lit by low posts creating golden circles on the dark grass, surrounded by high walls that left no doubt about what the message was. I went to the nightstand, drank the water, and lay on my back staring at the ceiling with my arms at my sides and my mind working at a steady pace. He knew my name, had a room prepared, had clothes in the closet and water on the nightstand. This wasn't improvisation, it was planning, and planning meant I was there for a specific reason, and a specific reason meant there was something my father knew that I didn't know, and this line of reasoning was the least comfortable of all, but it was the one that made the most sense with the exhaustion I'd seen in his shoulders that morning. I closed my eyes. Outside the door, in the hallway I would only discover later, there was a man in a dark suit and loosened tie who stood still for longer than any practical reason would justify before heading toward his office, not understanding yet, or perhaps not wanting to understand yet, that something had changed that night in a way that doesn't undo itself with distance or logic, or any of the tools he'd spent his life learning to use. He had said "my God" without meaning to, quietly, involuntarily. In the second I'd fallen into his arms at a party that neither of us should have turned into a starting point for anything, but some things begin before you realize they've begun. Chapter 2: Blood Debt and a Girl Who Won't Sit Still. I woke up with light coming through the cracks in the heavy curtains, and with my memory intact, which was both a relief and an inconvenience, because a brain that remembers everything first thing in the morning doesn't give the body a break when it still needs 10 more minutes. I lay there for exactly 30 seconds processing the wrong ceiling, the pillow that smelled like something neutral and expensive, and the room's silence that was too dense to be accidental. Then I got up, because lying around waiting for reality to improve has never been a method that worked for me. The clothes in the closet were my size, which disturbed me more than it should have, not because of the gesture itself, but because of its implication, the idea that someone had anticipated this with enough detail to include clothing size. I changed without overthinking it, washed my face, looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a second longer than necessary, searching for something in my own face that I couldn't name, and then left, because staring at myself in the mirror has never solved anything either. He was in the dining room when I came down, with a cup of coffee in his hand, and documents spread out in front of him, and the environment around him had that specific quality of places that obey a single person, without that person needing to raise their voice to establish it. I sat on the opposite side of the table without being invited, because waiting for an invitation in that situation seemed like the kind of courtesy I couldn't afford to practice, and I looked at him until he raised his eyes from the documents. "Coffee?" he asked, as if I were a weekend guest. "Explanations," I answered. "First." He closed the folder on the table with a slow, deliberate movement, the kind of movement of someone who has all the time in the world and wants you to know it, and looked at me with that direct attention I'd already cataloged the night before as one of the most unsettling things about him. There was no rush in his gaze, no cruelty, not the kind of satisfaction men with power sometimes carry when they have someone at a disadvantage. There was just that coldness of someone reading a contract before signing, calculating variables, waiting for the right moment. "Your father has owed the Castelli family for 11 years, he began, with the flat voice of someone presenting a report. "Money, yes, but mainly a business betrayal that cost lives." August Harding disappeared, thinking time would fix what he'd done. Time didn't fix it. He paused briefly, just long enough for the weight of what he'd said to land. "My father did." I listened without interrupting, which for anyone who knows me is a considerable feat, and kept my face still while the information organized itself inside me in layers I'd need to examine more carefully later, when I was alone, and could do it without an audience. "So I'm human collateral. That's one way to put it. Is there a more accurate way?" He didn't answer immediately, and the silence that came before the answer was an answer in itself, the kind you'd rather not have received. "You stay here until he pays what he owes," he said finally. "When he pays, you leave." I stood up slowly, without rush and without drama, and went to the window overlooking the same garden I'd seen from the bedroom window the night before. The morning light transformed it completely, revealing details the night lighting had kept to itself. The rows of rose bushes in the left corner, the stone fountain in the center, the tall trees creating generous bands of shade over the grass. It was a beautiful garden. This detail didn't help me with absolutely anything, but it was true, so I registered it. "How long?" I asked without turning. "Depends on your father." "And if he doesn't pay?" The silence that came after that was different from all the previous silences because this one had edges, had weight, had the specific quality of an answer that doesn't want to be given. And that quality told me everything I needed to know before any word was spoken. I turned, looked at him head on with everything I had, which at that moment was considerable. "Then you kidnapped the wrong person," I said, with the firmest voice I could manage. "Because I don't sit still waiting." Something passed across his expression again, that quick, involuntary movement I'd already noticed the night before, and that returned now with the same quality of something he hadn't planned to let slip. It wasn't shock. It was something closer to recognition, as if part of him already knew, before I said it, that this was going to be the kind of response I'd give. "Coffee," he said, and this time, it wasn't a question. The next 2 days were a silent negotiation of territory that neither of us had officially agreed to engage in. I explored what was available, the garden visible from the window but still inaccessible, the library I'd discovered by accident on the second floor, the hallways I was allowed without anyone explicitly saying which ones those were. There was a woman named Cora, who appeared with tea at the right times, and who looked at me with the expression of someone who'd seen a lot, and had decided judging was a waste of energy. There was a younger guy, with lively eyes and a smile he tried to hide, who I later found out was Romolo's brother. And there was Romolo, who I saw in the hallways and at meals with the regularity of something you try not to expect, and that shows up anyway. On the second day, in the afternoon, I discovered my phone had been blocked. I discovered this when I tried to call my father for the 10th time since I'd woken up in the mansion, and the phone simply couldn't find any signal in any of the 5 attempts that followed. I walked around the room, checking every corner with the device raised as if the signal were something that hides in specific spots on the ceiling, and then went to the window and confirmed what I'd already noticed but hadn't fully processed. The external lock, discreet but present, the kind that doesn't open from the inside. I went to the door and found, out there in the hallway, a man who wasn't family and who was standing with the unmistakable posture of someone being paid to be exactly where he is. 3 pieces of information: phone blocked, windows locked, guard at the door. And then I ran into Romolo in the hallway. I didn't plan it. That's the honest version, and I prefer honest versions even when they make me seem less reasonable than I'd like. I saw him turn the corner of the hallway with that slow, controlled stride, with the folder under his arm, and his gaze already adjusting to me before I'd even said anything, and something inside me simply decided that this was the moment, and that the moment didn't need preparation. I hit his chest with both hands before either of us fully processed what was happening. It wasn't hard enough to hurt. I knew that the moment I did it, and a small analytical part of me registered this information, even while the rest of me was busy with the anger and the strange relief of finally having done something concrete with all that energy that had been consuming me inside. It was hard enough to show I'd tried, and sometimes that's what matters. What happened next was fast and silent and absolutely terrifying, not because of what it contained of violence, because there was no violence, but precisely because of what there wasn't. He grabbed me by the wrists, turned me, put me with my back against the hallway wall with a calm that was more intimidating than anger could ever be, because anger is reaction, and this wasn't reaction. It was deliberate control. It was someone who had decided exactly what they were going to do before doing it, and executed with a precision that left no room for interpretation. His face was close to mine, close enough that I felt the heat radiating from his skin, and his dark eyes were on mine with that total attention that was simultaneously the most unsettling thing and the hardest to sustain. "Do that again, and I'll trade you for a room without windows." Voice low, almost gentle, which made it more serious than if it had been shouted. My heart was beating at the wrong rhythm. I noticed this, and also noticed with a specific discomfort that not all the reason for it was fear. "Do that again, and next time I'll aim better," I said, because it was what I had, and because backing down at that moment would be a kind of defeat I didn't allow myself. He stayed still for 2 seconds that were long in a way. 2 seconds aren't usually long, with his eyes still on mine and with something in his expression that wasn't anger. It was something before anger, something that anger normally covers, and that at that moment was visible because he hadn't had enough time to cover it. And what I saw in that something was the most unexpected thing I could have found there. It was almost respect. And by the way he released my wrists and took a step back with a deliberation that seemed to cost something, I understood that this almost respect irritated him more than the punch had. He looked at me for 1 more second, then turned and left down the hallway with the same stride as before, as if nothing had happened, as if hallways don't keep what just happened in their walls, and in the space between 2 meters of distance and a cold wall, and someone's wrists that you hadn't planned to meet. I stood where I was for a time I didn't count, with my back still against the wall, and my wrists still warm where his hands had been, and looked at the empty hallway in front of me trying to organize what I was feeling into an order that made sense. I couldn't, and that, I discovered then, was the most complicated part of everything. Chapter 3: The Garden and What He Shouldn't Have Seen. On the 5th day, Cora asked if I wanted to use the garden. She didn't ask directly, because Cora never did anything directly. She circled around subjects with the patience of someone who'd learned that most important conversations don't start with the most important point. She showed up with breakfast, arranged the tray with that silent precision of hers, and then said, with her back to me, that the garden was available during the day if I wanted fresh air. She said it in the way of someone transmitting logistical information and not a negotiated concession, but I'd already spent enough days in that mansion to know nothing was just logistical there. Did he authorize it? I asked. She looked at me over her shoulder with an expression that neither confirmed nor denied, and that in practice confirmed everything. I went to the garden after breakfast, with the Italian history book I'd grabbed from the library the day before, and the feeling of crossing that glass door and feeling the clean warmth of the sun on my shoulders was disproportionate to the gesture itself. The kind of relief you only realize the size of after it arrives. The garden was bigger than it looked from the windows, with stone paths that branched between well-kept beds and trees that created generous shade at the right times, and there was a fountain in the center that made the kind of water sound that exists specifically to compete with the noise in your head, and that morning, was winning the dispute with an ease I found personally offensive. I sat on the grass without worrying about the dress, because there were more important things to worry about, and because grass doesn't ruin character. I rested the book on my knee, breathed in the smell of earth and roses and morning, and stayed still in a way I couldn't inside. Inside, I was the version of me that fights, that questions, that occupies space with presence, because presence is the only currency I have to negotiate with there. Outside, under that sun, and with that water sound competing with my thoughts, I was just me, and just being me was more restful than anything I'd felt in the last 5 days. I didn't see him arrive. This is important, because I'd developed in those days a fairly sharp peripheral awareness of Romolo Castelli's presence, the kind of involuntary attention the body develops for things that represent important variables in the environment, and that in his case manifested as a kind of shift in the air temperature before he actually appeared. But that morning, I had my eyes closed to the sun, and the book open in my lap, and my mind somewhere between the fountain sound and the chapter about the Italian unification wars, and when I heard footsteps on the stone path, it was already too late to pretend I hadn't heard. I didn't open my eyes immediately. This was a detail I analyzed later with more attention than it deserved, and the conclusion I reached was that some part of me had decided, in that second, that it was better to let the moment last a little before turning it into an interaction. "You move differently out here," was what he said, and his voice in the garden's open air sounded different than in the hallways and rooms, less contained, as if the open space removed a layer of something that enclosed spaces added. I opened my eyes. He was standing a meter away, without his jacket this time, with his shirt sleeves rolled to mid-forearm, and the same direct gaze as always. but there was something in his posture that was slightly different from usual, a very slight absence of the customary rigidity, as if the garden did to him what it did to me, only he hadn't noticed yet. "Inside, I'm angry," I answered, looking at the garden in front of me. "Out here, I'm just here. Is there a difference?" "Huge." He stayed quiet for a moment, and then, without my having predicted it, or without him seeming to have planned it, he sat on the edge of the fountain, on the opposite side from me, with his elbows on his knees and his gaze toward the rose bushes. He didn't say anything. I didn't either. And the silence that stayed between us wasn't the tense silence of the hallways, or the calculated silence of meals. It was a third thing, more like the silence of people who are in the same place, without needing to justify it. "Do you have a garden?" I asked, because the question appeared, and because I'd learned that holding back questions usually made them bigger than they were. "This one's mine." "Do you use it?" A pause, not long, but present enough to be honest. "Not much." "Such a waste," I said, without judgment, because it wasn't judgment, it was just observation, and there was a considerable difference between the two that I hoped he knew how to distinguish. He looked at me sideways, quick, and returned to the rose bushes. He stayed there for 15 minutes that I counted without meaning to, and that he stayed without saying anything more and without leaving, which was in itself a way of saying something. When he stood up, it was with the same silent deliberation as always, and he left down the stone path without announcing he was going. I stayed on the grass for another half hour, looking at the fountain, and trying not to attribute too much meaning to 15 minutes of shared silence with a man who'd kidnapped me, with mixed results. The call with my father happened on the afternoon of the 5th day, in a small room with a window that didn't open, and with Romulo sitting 3 meters away, motionless and silent, in a presence that was simultaneously discreet and absolutely impossible to ignore. My father answered on the first ring. "Sky." His voice came out broken in the way that only happens when someone's been waiting for something for days, and when that thing finally happens, the body doesn't know whether to cry from relief or shock. "My God, Sky." "I'm fine, Dad," I said, with the firmness he needed to hear before anything else, because I know him, and I know he functions better when he has something solid to hold on to. "Just fix this." "I will, I swear, I'm all ready." "Dad." A pause. "How long?" The silence that came from the other side was long and full, and said everything the words would have said, and a few more things the words wouldn't have had the courage to say. I heard that silence with the part of me that's known my father for 24 years, and what I heard in it was the answer I didn't want to receive. I hung up. I didn't cry. I returned the phone to Cora, who was standing near the door with that neutral, attentive expression of hers, and then went to the garden because the garden was the only place in that mansion where I could be the exact size I was without needing to be bigger. I stayed there until the sun changed angles. I didn't open the book. The rain arrived 3 days later without warning, the way summer rain arrives, suddenly and with conviction, and I was in the garden when it started, sitting on the edge of the fountain, with the botany book I'd found on a low shelf in the library, and that had occupied me in an unexpectedly satisfying way all morning. The first drops arrived, and I looked at the sky before doing anything else, because sudden rain on a hot day has a specific quality of relief that you experience first with your face, before processing with any other part of your body. I stayed still. I didn't run. I didn't get up. I just stayed there while the rain increased in intensity and soaked my hair and shoulders and the pages of the book I'd closed but not put down, and there was something deeply right about it, about being drenched in someone else's garden on a Thursday afternoon, as if I had every right in the world to be exactly where I was. I didn't know he was watching me until later. Cora told me without meaning to, in the way Cora sometimes let things slip that she herself seemed not to have planned to let slip, in a passing comment about the umbrella she'd taken to the garden and that I'd refused. She said she'd stood with the umbrella in her hand for a moment, not knowing what to do with it, and that when she went back inside, the gentleman was still at the window. "For how long?" I asked. She looked at me with the expression she had when I asked questions whose answer she'd decided I didn't need, and left the library without answering, which was also an answer. That night I fell asleep before 10, which was new, because nights in that mansion had been until then endless exercises of sealing and thought, and I woke up at 2 in the morning with a dry throat and a heavy head in the way that announces the body is negotiating something with you without having consulted you first. By the end of the next day, I was in bed with a low fever, and that specific flu malaise that isn't serious enough to be dramatic, but is present enough to be irritating, especially when you're in a place that isn't yours, and where showing weakness seemed like a concession I'd rather not make. Cora appeared with tea, and with an efficiency of care that had nothing sentimental about it, but that was completely real, and I let her because I didn't have the energy to resist what was clearly competence, and not pity. I was awake, on my side in bed with the lamp low, when the door opened after midnight. It wasn't Cora. I knew before seeing, from the size of the shadow and the step. and I stayed still while he crossed the room with a cup in his hands and placed it on the nightstand, with a care that didn't match the way he did everything else, slowly, without sound, as if making noise were the last thing he wanted at that moment. He was going to turn. I knew this too, because it was what logic dictated. Put down the tea and leave, and there was something in that imminence that made me speak, before thinking whether I should. Romolo, he stopped at the door, with his back turned, with his hand still on the frame, and his shoulder slightly turned in my direction, not enough to see me, but enough to show he'd heard, and that he'd really stopped. Thank you. The silence that came after was long, the kind that contains more than one thing at once. He didn't answer. He left, and the door closed with that soft click as always. And I stayed looking at the cup of tea on the nightstand with the steam rising in a thin, straight line in the room's still air, thinking that this man had made the tea himself because Cora was asleep, and that this was a small piece of information, and at the same time absolutely impossible to ignore. I drank the tea to the end. I slept after that, which was something I hadn't been able to do easily in days, and I preferred not to examine the connection between the two things too closely. Some truths become truer when you don't look directly at them. Chapter 4. When he stops pretending she's just a piece. Cora looked at me with that expression of hers when I asked permission to reorganize the library. It wasn't surprise exactly. It was something closer to the resignation of someone who realizes a certain force of nature is going to do what it's going to do, and that the most sensible thing is to decide how to position yourself in relation to it. She stood in the library doorway for a second, looked at me, looked at the shelves, looked at me again, and said yes, with the tone of someone hoping not to have to explain this later. I spent the entire morning there. There was something almost meditative about that work, in the act of taking out book by book, examining what it was, deciding where it belonged, creating an order that made sense for someone who actually wanted to use that space, and not just accumulate it. The Italian history books went to the back wall, organized by period, architecture, next to them, and the antique maps, which had been distributed without criteria across 3 different shelves as if no one had noticed what they were, got an entire section on the window wall, where the light came in well, and where each one could be seen without needing to search. I left post-its on the ones I'd browsed, with observations that seemed relevant to me, and with some questions I hadn't answered because the answers weren't in that specific volume. It was the kind of thing I did with my own books at home, and that here seemed natural before I realized it wasn't my library, and that maybe I should have thought about that before writing on 8 different post-its. It was already late when I heard footsteps in the hallway. I recognized them before he appeared in the doorway, which had become an involuntary and slightly inconvenient skill I'd developed without asking for it. I didn't raise my eyes from the book I was holding, a 19th century botany encyclopedia with illustrations that were small works of art in themselves, and waited. "You read these?" His voice came from the doorway, and there was in it something that wasn't quite surprise, but was from the same family. The ones I could in 2 days. I didn't raise my eyes. "You have an impressive collection of Italian history, but zero fiction. Fiction is, don't say it's a waste of time." A pause. Less efficient. Now I raised my eyes. He was in the doorway with his arms crossed, and that posture of someone who occupies space without needing to expand their gestures for it, and looked at me with an attention that had become, in recent days, a physical presence in itself, something I felt before processing that I was being looked at. "Efficient," I repeated, savoring the word with gentle irony. "You use that word for everything you don't want to feel." He went absolutely still, and this kind of stillness in him was different from normal silence. It was the silence of someone who's recalculating, who received information they hadn't expected, and who's deciding what to do with it before responding. "You don't know me. I know people who protect themselves by pretending they're only logic." I returned my eyes to the book, because sustaining them on his for too long was starting to cost something I preferred not to spend. I was raised by one. The silence that came after was different from all the previous ones. It didn't have the tension of the silences from the first days, nor the calculated neutrality of those that came after. It was a silence that breathed, that had temperature, that occupied the space between the door and the shelf where I was with a presence I felt on my skin before feeling it anywhere else. He entered the library. He didn't say anything. He stood looking at the maps I'd organized on the window wall, and there was something in the way he looked at them, slowly, with an attention that wasn't inspection but of someone seeing something for the first time despite having been there for years. That made me stay silent too, because interrupting that moment seemed wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. "You created a cartography section," he said finally. "They were scattered across 3 shelves. It was a waste. You use that word for everything you think could be better." I raised my eyes. He was looking at me over his shoulder with that corner of his mouth that didn't quite reach a smile, but was from the same family. And there was in that gaze is a closeness that the physical distance between us wasn't adequately compensating for. Learned from someone, I said. He looked at me for a second longer than necessary for anything that had a practical answer, and then turned back to the maps. Dinner was Nico's idea, who presented the proposal with the energy of someone selling something they know will meet resistance, but who genuinely believes in the product. He said, with a casualness I suspected was more calculated than it seemed, that it would be less tense if they had dinner together, and used the word tense with the invisible quotes of someone saying one thing and meaning another. Romulo agreed. I learned this when Cora appeared to let me know, and I couldn't decide what to do with the information that he'd agreed, so I pretended not to have noticed, and went down to dinner with the botany book under my arm, because I was in the middle of a chapter. The table was big for 4 people, but Nico had the gift of filling space with presence and conversation, and the initial silence lasted less than I'd predicted before he started asking me questions with the genuine curiosity of someone who wasn't trying to extract strategic information, who just wanted to know. He asked about New York, about what I did, about the mental garden I'd mentioned in passing 2 days before without expecting him to have retained it. I made Nico laugh 3 times, the 3rd time for real. With that smile that arrived first in the eyes and then in the mouth, he pointed at me and said, "She's funny," to his brother, with the tone of someone presenting a discovery. Romolo didn't respond, but I'd looked at him at that exact second, quickly and involuntarily, and what I found was a gaze that was on me with an attention that had nothing strategic about it, and that he redirected to his plate with a speed that was in itself information. The heat that rose up my neck was inconvenient and completely unsolicited. After dinner, without anyone asking, and without my having planned it, I helped Cora clear the table. She looked at me with the controlled surprise of someone trying not to show surprise and not completely succeeding, and said I didn't need to. "You bring me tea every night without being asked." I stacked the plates carefully. Seems fair. She went to the kitchen without responding, which with Cora was a form of response, and I had my back to the room when I felt, with that involuntary perception I'd developed in days of forced coexistence, that Romulo was still at the table and hadn't left, and was watching me. I didn't turn. I finished clearing the table, followed Cora to the kitchen, and only then allowed myself to feel the weight of that gaze I'd carried on my back for 3 full minutes without letting it reach my face. I had a problem. This was getting hard to ignore. I entered his office without knocking because the door was ajar, and because knocking on ajar doors has always seemed like an unnecessary formality to me, and I immediately regretted it not because of what I found, which was just Romulo over documents with the total concentration of someone solving something that requires real attention, but because of the way he raised his eyes, and the way I felt those eyes, which were exactly the problem I was trying not to name. "Do you have rules in this house?" I said, because I had a purpose, and purpose was what kept me organized. "Several." "Then why didn't anyone tell me?" "Because you're not a guest." "Am I a prisoner then?" I took a step into the office because maintaining physical distance from that man had stopped being strategy and had become habit, and habits created by fear didn't interest me, because prisoners have rights too. He stood up. And this simple gesture, just a man standing from a chair, crossed the space between us with a weight that had nothing simple about it. He was tall, I'd established that from the first day, but there was something different in his office, in the smaller space, in the lower light, in the absence of other people who served as a buffer between the reality that existed when we were alone, and the more contained version I could maintain when there were witnesses. He came toward me, stopped close enough that I had to tilt my head slightly to hold his gaze, and the heat radiating from him was a physical presence in the air between us, something I felt before anything I could name with words. "Garden, library, your room, dining room," he said, with that low voice he used when he wanted the words to arrive without needing volume. "And the rest? The rest is mine. Your whole house is yours, Castelli, and you're inside it. One step. Just one. But the space between us was already too small for one step not to mean something. So, I suggest you respect that." I didn't back away. This was the part where I should have backed away, and I knew it, and I didn't anyway because there was something in that proximity that was simultaneously the smartest thing to avoid and the hardest to leave, like being near a heat source in the cold and knowing you're staying too long and not being able to move. "Do you do this to intimidate everyone?" "It works on everyone, not on me." His gaze changed. Not the expression, which remained quiet and controlled as always, but something within the gaze, a layer that moved from one place to another like light-changing angles, and what became visible for that second was something he clearly hadn't planned to let be visible, because the next second he took a step back, with a deliberation that cost more than any casual withdrawal would cost. He backed away first, and that said more than any word he'd said in that room, or in any room before that one, because men who back away first aren't indifferent, they're afraid, and fear, in that specific man, was the most revealing information I'd received since I'd woken up in a room that wasn't mine with a ceiling I didn't recognize. I left the office with measured, regular steps and climbed the stairs with that calm that was half real and half constructed. And only when I reached the bedroom and closed the door and leaned against it with my back in the dark did I let my lungs do what they wanted, which was to expel the air I'd held for too long without realizing it. My heart was beating at the wrong rhythm. This time I didn't bother pretending it wasn't because of him. Chapter 5. Nameless Romance and Endless Denial. He started showing up in the garden in the third week. The first time, I pretended not to notice. He set up his laptop on the stone table near the entrance, opened documents with that deliberate concentration of someone demonstrating their working, and stayed there for 40 minutes without directing a word at me, and without me directing any at him. And when he left, it was without announcing. Just footsteps on the stone path and then silence again. The second time, I no longer pretended. I raised my eyes from the book when he arrived, watched him settle in with the same ritual as before, and then returned to reading with a tranquility that was more honest than anything I'd managed to maintain near him inside the house. The third time, he arrived, and I'd already left space on the stone table without having planned to do it. He noticed. He didn't say anything. He placed the laptop exactly where there was space and opened the documents, and the silence that stayed between us was the kind that has texture, that you can almost touch, a living, quiet thing that neither of us disturbed because disturbing it seemed like the kind of mistake that doesn't undo itself. It was in one of these silences that I told him about my mother. It wasn't planned. I need to make that clear, because the planned version of me wouldn't have done that. Not there, not with him. But I was looking at the rose bushes and thinking about gardens, and gardens inevitably led me to the memory of a photograph my father kept on his desk, a dark-haired woman in a smaller garden than this one, smiling at the camera with the kind of carefree ease I'd spent my life trying to understand whether it was real or performative. And before I decided to keep the thought to myself, I'd already said out loud that my mother had died when I was 2, and that I knew her only from photographs and from the way my father went quiet when someone said her name. Romolo closed the laptop. He didn't say anything for a moment, and when he spoke, it was with a different voice from the voice of the office and the hallways, less constructed, more direct in the sense of something going from one place to another without passing through a filter. "Do you look like her?" he asked. "In the eyes. That's what my father says when he's missing her, and forgets he's saying it out loud." He went quiet again, but it was a silence that listened, and there was a huge difference between silence that listens and silence that just waits for its turn to speak. I'd learned it early, growing up with a father who sometimes needed presence more than answers, and I recognized in Romolo that same kind of attention, dense and real, the kind you feel in your chest before identifying where it comes from. "My brother almost died 5 years ago," he said finally, looking at the fountain. "Accident. He was in a coma for 3 weeks. A pause. Nico." I looked at him. He didn't look back, but there was something in his shoulders that had changed position slightly. A minimal opening that in that specific man was the equivalent of opening an entire window. It was the first time I understood there were things I couldn't control no matter what I did. He said, still not looking at me. "Didn't like the discovery." "No one does. You seem used to it." "I'm used to the idea." I answered honest. "Still working on the practice." He looked at me then, sideways and from below, with that corner of the eye look that was more revealing than a direct look, because it had less time to be arranged before arriving, and what I saw in it for that second was something that wasn't in the documents or in the hallways or in any of the controlled versions of him I'd cataloged until then. It was something older and more tired and more human than all of that, and it lasted only a second before he turned his eyes back to the fountain, but it was enough for me to feel something reorganize in my chest in a way I knew wouldn't undo itself easily. We didn't comment on how much we'd told each other that afternoon. That was the tacit agreement, the unspoken rule of the garden, that what was said there stayed in a different register from the rest, and that asking too much about what had been said would be the kind of gesture that would undo what had been built. The rain returned on a Friday afternoon with the same conviction as the first time, but this time I heard it coming. The smell before the drops and the wind that lowered the temperature in 3 minutes before a single drop touched the ground, and I stayed where I was on the grass with the book in my lap, because there was something I wanted to confirm about that rain and about what it did to the garden when no one was watching. What it did was make it completely other and completely the same at the same time. The colors more saturated, the smell denser, the fountain irrelevant against the sound of the rain on the branches and stones and grass around me, and I was in the middle of it all getting quite thoroughly soaked. When I noticed there was a cup of tea on the porch waiting for me, there was no cup on the porch. I knew this because I looked. But there was something in the office window that I identified with peripheral vision and that I didn't examine head-on, because examining it head-on would undo the plausible deniability I was trying to maintain about the fact that he was watching me in the rain and that the information that I'd refused the umbrella had reached him and that he'd stayed anyway. I came in soaked 20 minutes later, with the book saved under my arm for having been the only protective instinct that had worked, and found Nico in the hallway with that smile he tried to hide without success. "You like rain," he said, with the tone of someone verifying an already confirmed hypothesis. "I do." He stayed at the window, Nico said, and there was a lightness in his voice that was simultaneously casual and completely intentional. "I know," I answered, and kept walking. Nico stayed in the hallway behind me, probably with that smile still on his face, and I climbed the stairs with my hair dripping and my heart doing that inconvenient thing that had become recurrent and that I was too tired to fight, especially soaked. That night, he showed up again. I wasn't sick this time, so there was no practical justification whatsoever, and I think that's what caught both of us by surprise. The absence of justification, just the presence of the fact itself. I was on the bedroom balcony, which was small and overlooked the side of the garden where the rose bushes were, with the botany book that had become a kind of continuity object in those weeks, and I heard him arrive before seeing him. Footsteps in the hallway, stopping at the height of my door and staying there for a second before continuing. But they didn't continue. There was a light knock, the kind that gives you the option to pretend you didn't hear, and I said come in before analyzing whether I should, and the door opened, and he stood in the entrance with his hands on the frame, and his eyes going first to me, and then to the balcony, and then to the open book in my lap with that expression of someone evaluating something they hadn't expected to find. "You're not sleeping," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Neither are you." He came in. He walked to the balcony with that deliberate stride of his, and stood leaning against the railing, his back to the garden and facing me, and the low light of the balcony did things with the shadows on his face that made everything slightly harder than it already was. "May I?" I gestured to the chair beside me. He sat, and we both stayed in silence for a time I didn't count, with the distant sound of the fountain, and with the night air that smelled of wet earth after the afternoon rain. And in that silence there was an intimacy that hadn't been negotiated, and that was there anyway, built over weeks of garden and books and conversations that had reached places neither of us had mapped in advance. The next afternoon I was identifying in the garden the plant from the east corner that I'd found described in the botany book, and when he arrived, I didn't need to hear the footsteps to know. It was just that shift in the air that had accompanied me since the first week, and that had stopped being unsettling and had become, with a softness I hadn't noticed while it was happening, something close to familiar. "Look," I said, and held the open book toward him with the illustration facing up, pointing with my finger at the plant in the corner, and then at the page. "It's exactly this one. Look at the leaf. The central vein." He leaned in to see, and that's exactly when the space between us simply disappeared. Not dramatically, not with any specific gesture from either of us, just the sum of me having leaned in to show, and him having leaned in to see, and suddenly the distance between my shoulder and his was in centimeters, and the heat radiating from his skin was a completely real presence in the air between us. I kept pointing at the illustration for 2 seconds that were the 2 longest seconds of that week, and then I stopped, because there was nothing more I was actually seeing on the page. He didn't pull away. I felt the moment he noticed the proximity the same way I had, a slight change in his breathing, almost imperceptible, the kind you only notice when you're close enough to notice, and the book stayed open between us like a pretext that had expired and that neither of us had closed yet. "Sky," his voice came out different, lower, with that texture it had when he hadn't had time to arrange it before speaking, and I raised my eyes from the book and found his exactly where I knew they would be, too close and too dark, and with that visible layer that appeared sometimes when he couldn't cover it in time. His phone rang. The sound was a physical intrusion in the air between us, and he blinked, just once, before taking the device from his pocket with a movement that had a fraction of hesitation before being executed. He looked at the screen, answered, and stepped back 2 paces with the phone to his ear and his eyes going to me for a second before turning in the opposite direction. I closed the book, looked at the rose bushes, breathed the afternoon air with the smell of earth and plants, and something I'd stopped trying not to feel, because it wasn't working anyway. Cora was at the glass door when I turned, with her face toward the inside of the house, and the posture of someone who definitely hadn't seen anything, which with Cora meant she'd seen everything. I went inside without saying anything, climbed the stairs, sat on the edge of the bed with the book in my lap, and stared at the cover for a considerable time, thinking that there was a plant in the east corner of the garden that I'd identified with precision, and that there was another thing there I'd identified with the same precision, and that was being much less easy to catalog into a safe category and file away, because safe categories presuppose that the thing you're trying to catalog stays still while you decide where to put it, and Romolo Castelli didn't stay still in any of the places I tried to put him. Chapter 6. What he feels and what can't be. I knew something had changed in the mansion before understanding what. It was one of those perceptions that arrive through the body before arriving through the head, a different tension in the air of the hallways, a specific quality in the silence that Cora carried with her that morning, while arranging the breakfast tray with slightly excessive attention to the position of the cups. I watched her for a moment, calibrated what I was seeing, and decided that asking directly would be inefficient because Cora didn't answer direct questions about things she'd decided I didn't need to know. So I went to the garden and waited for the day to tell me on its own. It didn't take long. Around noon, I heard voices in Romulo's office, the muffled tone of conversation that doesn't want to be heard crossing the mansion's thick wall, with the insistence of something that doesn't contain itself completely, and one of the timbres was deep and familiarly controlled, and the other was older and colder, and had that specific quality of authority that doesn't need to try, because it was built over decades of being obeyed without question. Domatore Castelli was at the mansion. I hadn't seen him yet, but I'd heard the name at the edges of conversations that weren't mine, pronounced with that involuntary reverence people reserve for things they respect and fear simultaneously. He was Romulo's father. He was the man who'd ordered the kidnapping. And there was something in the idea of his presence in that house that made the air slightly heavier, like atmospheric pressure increasing before a storm. I stayed in the garden. The fountain made its usual sound. The rose bushes had no opinion about Dom Ettore Castelli. I tried to adopt the same posture, with mixed results. I didn't hear what was said in that office, but I saw Romulo after. He went to the garden at the end of the afternoon with the laptop but didn't open it, which was new, and sat at the stone table looking at the fountain with that expression I'd learned to read in recent weeks the same way you learn to read weather. Not with absolute certainty, but with enough familiarity to distinguish the types. This expression wasn't the calculated coldness of the first days or the careful openness of the garden conversations. It was something heavier, older, the kind that appears when a person has been reminded of a version of themselves they'd started to forget. I sat on my usual side of the fountain without saying anything, because there were moments when the most honest thing was just to be present, and this was clearly one of them. We stayed in silence for a long time. The sun went down. The tree shadows grew on the grass. "Your father was here," I said finally. Not as a question, he was. And he looked at me. And there was in that look an honesty that reached my chest with a force disproportionate to the size of the gesture. Because it was the look of someone carrying something heavy, and who for a second considered the possibility of sharing the weight before deciding they couldn't. "Nothing you need to know right now," he said, and his voice was lower than normal, closer to something real than to a constructed answer. I looked at him for a moment, then looked at the fountain. "Okay," I said simply, and didn't press, because there was a difference between what I wanted to know and what was my right to ask, and I was starting to have trouble keeping that distinction clear when it came to him. He kept looking at me for a second longer than I'd expected, with that expression I couldn't name, but that reached the center of my chest like heat, and then turned back to the fountain, and stayed there until the sun disappeared completely. Valentina Serra arrived the next day. I knew it was her before being introduced, because there was a specific type of woman who enters a room as if she already knew exactly how much space she'd occupy, and how much space she'd take from everything else, and Valentina Serra was that type, with a precision that bordered on art. She was beautiful the way very sharp things are sometimes beautiful, with an elegance that had too much structure to be casual, and an amiability that had too much distance to be real. She saw me in the garden before any formal introduction happened, and there was a second, just one, when her eyes traveled over me with the speed and efficiency of a complete evaluation, before becoming again the gentle, composed surface she presented to the world. 3 seconds total, and I knew in those 3 seconds everything I needed to know about Valentina Serra, and about what my presence in that mansion meant to her. At dinner, she came to my side of the table with the kind of kindness that has a knife inside. "What an interesting story yours is," she said, with that teeth smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Kidnapped and yet so adaptable," I corrected calmly. "Different from adapted. What's the difference?" She tilted her head slightly with the expression of curiosity that wasn't curiosity. "Adapted is permanent." I placed my fork on the plate carefully. "Adaptable is choice." She smiled again, and this time there was something in the smile that was almost respect and almost anger in equal proportions, the expression of someone who'd expected less resistance and was recalibrating in real time. "Choice," she repeated, savoring the word. "What a fascinating perspective on your situation." "Situations are what they are," I said. "Perspective is all always choice. Nico looked at me with that smile he hid without success, and I avoided meeting Romulo's eyes because I knew if I did, I'd lose something of the composure I was maintaining with considerable effort. I met them anyway, because it was inevitable. He was looking at me with an attention that had nothing neutral about it, with that dark, direct gaze that had become in recent days a thing I felt before seeing, and there was in it something I'd never found before in that face, something close to discomfort. The specific kind that doesn't come from an external situation but from an internal situation that the external situation is making difficult to keep ignoring. I looked away first, continued dinner, answered Valentina when necessary, ignored when possible, and concentrated on not showing how much that woman disturbed me, not because of what she was in herself, but because of what she represented about Romolo's world, about the type of alliance that existed in that universe and about the space I occupied or didn't occupy in it. I left dinner before dessert with an excuse no one contested, and climbed the stairs with that quietness of someone storing things for later because now isn't the time. Later came in the form of voices in the downstairs hallway, and I was on the bedroom balcony with the closed book in my lap when I heard the tone of conversation between the two brothers crossing the night's silence with that insistence of something that doesn't want to be contained. I didn't mean to listen. This is true, and it's relevant because what I heard was the kind of thing that changes the geometry of what you were trying to keep in place, and I would have preferred not to receive this information at that specific moment in that specific way. You're in love with her. Nico's voice, direct, without a questioning tone. Romulo's silence lasted the length of a breath. No, Romulo. She's August Harding's daughter. His voice was flat and constructed, and cost exactly enough for me to know it was constructed. She's here because of a blood debt. When her father pays, she leaves. And if her father doesn't pay soon, she leaves anyway. You're going to send her away. Yes, even if you don't want to. The pause that came before the answer was too long for any denial that came after it to be completely believable, and I stayed absolutely still on the balcony with the book in my lap, and my heart doing that inconvenient thing in my chest. Especially if I don't want to, he said finally, with a voice that had the quality of a decision made before the conversation existed, the kind you make not because you want to, but because you believe you have to. Nico didn't respond immediately. When he spoke, it was with a softness I hadn't heard in him before, older and more tired than his usual tone. You're going to regret it. I've already made the decision. Romulo. She reorganized the library. She stood in the rain with a book. She made Cora like her in 4 days, and Cora doesn't like anyone in less than a year. A pause. You know exactly what she is. I do. And there was in that word a weight that reached the balcony with a force that didn't diminish in the journey. That's exactly why. Nico's footsteps moved away. The silence returned, and I stayed on the balcony for a long time, looking at the dark garden below, at the rose bushes that weren't visible but that I knew where they were, at the fountain I heard but didn't see, and tried to organize what I'd heard into a form that would fit inside me without taking up too much space. I couldn't, because there was a fundamental difference between suspecting something and hearing it said out loud in that specific voice, and that difference had edges, and had weight, and had the exact temperature of something you knew was going to change something before knowing exactly what. He knew what he felt. What? He'd said out loud that he was going to send me away, especially because he didn't want to, which was simultaneously the most honest and the most painful thing I'd heard in those weeks, and there was something deeply unfair about the fact that a man's honesty could hurt the same way a lie does. I went to bed without reading. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling with my arms at my sides, and my mind working at that steady rhythm I knew well, and thought about gardens, and shared silences, and a man who'd made tea at 2 a.m, and who'd stood at the window in the rain, and who'd said especially if I don't want to, with the voice of someone who'd already decided that protecting was the only form of love he knew how to offer. And I thought that maybe the problem wasn't what he felt, the problem was what he was going to do about it. Chapter 7. She doesn't want to leave anymore, and he sends her away anyway. I knew before they told me. It wasn't from any concrete information. It wasn't from overheard conversation or a document seen by chance on some table. It was from the air in the mansion that morning, which had a different quality from the air of all previous mornings, more tense and at the same time more resolved, like the atmosphere after an important decision that hasn't been communicated yet, but has already changed the weight of everything around it. Cora brought coffee with a silence denser than usual, her eyes going to me and back to the tray with a frequency that wasn't casual. Nico didn't show up for breakfast, which in weeks of coexistence had become exception enough to be noticed. And there was the garden. I went to the glass door after coffee and stood there for a moment with my hand on the frame, looking outside with that involuntary attention the body develops for things it's about to lose before the head has received the official notice. The morning light was on the rose bushes with that specific angle of weekend mornings that I'd learned to distinguish from weekday mornings by how it hit the east corner of the garden, and the fountain made its usual sound, and the stone path was empty with the familiar contours I'd memorized without having planned to memorize. I had made that garden my garden, without asking permission, without signing anything, just through weeks of presence that accumulated until the spaces were marked by the passage of someone who'd been there long enough to leave a trace. And that perception arrived that morning with the quiet weight of something that had been true for so long that admitting it didn't change anything anymore, just named what was. I didn't open the door. I went back to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed with my hands in my lap, and my mind working at that silent rhythm it used when processing something it preferred not to process. I looked at the closet, at the clothes that had been bought in my size by someone who'd anticipated my presence with a precision that had disturbed me the first week, and that had become, over time, one of the many things about that place I'd stopped questioning and simply incorporated. I looked at the nightstand, at the cup of tea Cora had brought that was still warm, and at the botany book I'd left there open to the page of the east corner plant, with the post-it I'd written 2 days before still folded in the margin. I'd arrived at that mansion with 2 objectives that seemed absolute and simple to me: survive and leave. And at some point between the first week and that Monday morning with the warm tea and the open book and the garden on the other side of the glass door, one of those objectives had changed address without my having signed any authorization for it. Cora's knock on the door had that precision of 3 taps of hers, and the message was transmitted with the careful formality of someone who'd been instructed about the exact words, that the gentleman would like to see me in the office when I was available. When I was available, as if I had a schedule in that mansion, as if that phrase weren't just the polite version of now. I stood up, fixed my hair in the mirror, without really looking at what I was fixing, left. I went the long way, the hallway that passed the library, because there was something about that route I needed to do before doing the other. I passed the open door and entered for a moment, just one, and stood looking at the shelves with the organization I'd created that afternoon weeks ago, the history books on the back wall, the cartography section on the window wall with the light coming in right, the post-its that were still on the books I'd browsed with notes in my small slanted handwriting. There was something about that space that was mine, in a way the bedroom had never been completely, because the bedroom had been prepared for me, but the library I'd prepared on my own, and that difference mattered in a way I couldn't articulate at the time, but that I felt with precision. I left the library, went downstairs, knocked on the office door because this time it seemed like the right gesture, and entered when he said come in with that deep voice that crossed doors easily. He was standing in the middle of the office, not sitting over documents, not leaning against the window, not in any of the positions I'd catalogued over the weeks as Romolo Castelli's usual positions at rest, standing and still, with his shoulders in correct posture, and the dark suit and the tie in place, and there was in that static verticality something more exposed than any work position would have allowed, because furniture and distances function as shields, and he'd chosen to be without either. I registered that before registering anything else. "Your father paid," he said, with the flat, direct voice of someone reading an announcement, without preamble and without ornament, the way he did difficult things, head on, and without unnecessary softening, because softening was a form of condescension he didn't practice. I stood where I was, 2 meters from the door, and let the information occupy the space it needed before trying to say anything. "The debt is settled," he continued, and went to the window with that movement of someone who needs distance without having anywhere to go, because leaving the room wasn't an option, and the window was the only point in the office that offered something other than me. "You can leave today. The car is available whenever you want. Romolo, Sky," my name in that voice, with that quality he couldn't take out of it no matter how much he tried to build distance around it, that direct present thing that arrived before any filter. This was always going to end like this. I know how it was going to end, and I took a step. Just one, but enough for him to notice by his shoulders that he'd noticed, a minimal tension I knew well enough to recognize. "But you know what happened in the middle," he stayed quiet. Looking through the window at the garden, I couldn't see from there, but that I knew exactly how it was at that moment. The morning light on the rose bushes, the fountain, the stone path with the contours I'd memorized. "Nothing happened," he said. The word landed in the air between us with a weight completely disproportionate to its size, and stayed there occupying space with the dense presence of something that's said and can't be called back, and I heard it with all the attention it deserved before responding. "Nothing," I repeated slowly, savoring each syllable with the precision of someone who wants the other to hear their own lie being returned. "You can say that. It's the truth. It's a lie." And my voice came out firm, without tremor, without volume, Because real anger doesn't need volume, it just needs precision and clarity and presence. And I had all three at that moment with an intensity that had taken weeks to accumulate. And you know it is. He turned, and that was the worst moment for him to do it. The most inopportune and most inevitable moment at the same time. Because my eyes were full, and I wasn't letting them fall. I was holding with all the stubbornness that had kept me whole in those weeks, and that had become the most expensive thing I possessed in those walls. And that kind of courage, the courage to be shattered in front of someone and not back down, had always been the one that cost me most, because it was the one that exposed me most. He looked at me, and what was in his expression wasn't the coldness of the first days. It wasn't the dawn of the hallways and documents and calculated looks. It was just a man looking at something he wanted and had decided not to have, and who was paying the price of that decision in real time in front of me, with an involuntary honesty that hurt more than any deliberate cruelty would have hurt, because cruelty can be defended, and that had no defense. You need to leave, Sky. Why? And the questions came out before I decided to let them out. Not because I'd lost control, but because I'd reached a point where holding back questions was energy I simply didn't have to spend anymore. Because your father says so? Because I'm the enemy's daughter? Because it's easier to send me away than to admit? Because if you stay, I won't be able to do what I need to do. The silence that came after that sentence had inside it the specific texture of real honesty, the kind that comes out anyway despite the cost. That escapes not because the person forgot to hold it, but because it had reached a point where holding it was costing more than letting it go. And I stood still, processing those words with all the attention they deserved, and that I wasn't sure I could maintain for much longer. And what do you need to do? 1 breath. 2. And when he spoke, it was with a voice that had dropped in tone, in a way that made each word more physical, more present, more impossible not to feel in the exact place where I was already feeling it. Protect you. From my world. From myself. I didn't slam the door. That was a deliberate choice, because part of me wanted the noise and the gesture, and the physical satisfaction of doing something concrete with everything that was compressed inside. But I'd learned in those weeks that the reactions that reached that specific man most were always the most contained ones, and so I left the office with regular steps and closed the door with the soft click as always, and went down the hallway with that calm that was half real and half constructed, and that I needed to last at least until upstairs. It lasted. I took what was mine, which was fewer things than I'd come to think, because most of what I'd accumulated in those walls weren't objects you put in a bag. The botany book stayed on the nightstand, the post-its stayed on the library books, the garden stayed where it was, which was the only place it could stay. Cora was in the hallway when I came out with my bag, and she didn't say anything, just walked beside me to the base of the stairs, with that silent, solid presence that had been, in those weeks, one of the most constant and most honest things about that mansion. On the last step she stopped, and I turned to her with the bag on my shoulder and eyes I was keeping dry with an effort that was reaching its limit. I placed my hand on her arm for a second. She didn't pull away. "Thank you for the tea," I said. She made that gesture with her chin, that was her version of everything she'd decided didn't need to be said out loud, and stood at the base of the stairs, while I crossed the hall with the steps I'd counted so many times in those weeks. 18 from the bedroom to the stairs, 12 from the stairs to the hall, 8 from the hall to the main door. I counted again, automatically. Without meaning to, the air outside had the temperature and smell of air that exists outside of places where you stayed too long, different from the inside air in a way you can only distinguish when you leave. And I stood still at the entrance for a second with the sun on my shoulders, and the distant sound of the fountain coming from the garden side I wasn't looking at, because looking was the kind of thing I couldn't do at that moment and stay standing the way I needed to stay. The car was at the entrance. The driver opened the door without my needing to ask. Before getting in, I turned. I looked at the mansion's facade with that specific clarity of last time, that the gaze develops when it knows it's storing something and wants to do it right. The dark stone and the arches and the tall windows and the office window upstairs with the curtain in place, closed, opaque, with no one visible from outside. I got in the car. I cried after the iron gate disappeared in the rearview mirror. It wasn't the dramatic cry I maybe deserved at that moment. It wasn't collapse or screaming. It was the quiet cry of someone releasing something they'd held for long enough that containment had become structure. And when structure goes, it's slow and without sound. Tears falling while I looked through the side window at the world that continued outside with the indifference the world maintains toward what's happening inside passing cars. The driver kept his eyes on the road the entire trip. I was grateful for that in a way I didn't articulate out loud, but that was real and complete. At the mansion, Romolo stayed at the office window for a time, that Nico, when he entered without knocking, didn't ask how long it had been. He stood beside his brother in silence, looking at the entrance where the car had stopped and from where it had left, with that lateral presence of younger brother who knows the limits of what's welcome, and stays within them when it matters. The garden was visible from the window, with the morning light on the rose bushes and the fountain and the empty stone path, and there was something about that specific emptiness that was different from the emptiness before her, though geometrically they were the same thing. After a long time, Romolo said, "I did the right thing." Nico didn't respond. "I did," and there was in the repetition something that wasn't conviction, but was trying to be. The kind of affirmation you make not to convince the other, but to hear it out loud, and decide if you believe it. "Okay, Nico," with that neutral voice that neither agreed nor contested, that was just present. "Nico, I didn't say anything, Romolo, and that didn't say anything said everything," with the silent precision of a brother who knows enough to know that certain truths settle better when they're not named by anyone other than whoever needs to hear them, and that the right silence, at the right moment, reaches deeper than any words would have. Romolo stayed at the window. The fountain kept making its sound down there, in the empty garden that had been, for weeks, and without any formal signature, the garden of the two of them. Chapter 8. Broken Hearts and the Party That Shouldn't Have Happened. 2 months is an amount of time that seems abstract, until you have to cross it, day by day. I returned to life with the silent continuity of someone resuming their own spaces, and discovering they stayed the same size while she became different. The apartment was as I'd left it, with the 3 pots on the balcony, and the morning light coming through the kitchen window, and the books on the shelves in the order I'd established years before, and that had never seemed insufficient to me, until I'd spent weeks in a library reorganized from scratch with sections created by me, and post-its in my handwriting on 8 different volumes. I went back to work, had lunch with my father on Tuesdays, laughed when there was reason to laugh, which was less frequently than before, and with an effort I hoped wasn't visible but probably was. The balcony with the 3 pots became the afternoon habit. I'd go after work, take a book, stay longer than the reading justified, and the rose bush in the middle pot had sprouted in June with flowers smaller than the mansion's but with the same smell, which was information I hadn't requested, and that arrived anyway every time the wind hit at the right angle. My father noticed I'd come back different. He always notices, which is simultaneously the best and most inconvenient characteristic of his, and went 2 weeks without saying anything before speaking on a Sunday lunch with coffee in hand, and the afternoon sun coming through the living room window. "You liked him," he said, and it wasn't a question. I stayed looking at the cup for a second before raising my eyes to him. "Dad, Sky." He looked at me with those eyes I'd known for 24 years, and that carried at that moment an exhaustion older than that Sunday, the kind that accumulates when you keep something for too long. "I know what I did. I know what happened because of what I did." His voice was low, with the quality of rehearsed words that come out crooked anyway. "You were used to punish me. It wasn't intentional on my part, but intention doesn't change what happened." "I know, Dad. Are you okay?" I thought for real, because he deserved for real, because automatic answers to important questions are a form of disrespect I didn't want to practice with him. "I will be," I said finally, and it was the most honest thing I had that Sunday. He placed his hand over mine on the table with that simple gesture he'd made since I was little, and didn't say anything more, and I stayed there with the coffee cooling and my father's solid, familiar hand over mine, and thought that there are things time solves and things time just accommodates, and that knowing the difference is a skill you learn at the cost of not having known in time. Romolo had gotten colder after I left. It wasn't the coldness of the first days, which was calculated and had real temperature underneath it. It was a different coldness, more uniform and more complete, the kind that appears when someone deliberately turned something off and closed the switch with the intention of not returning. Nico described this later as seeming like someone had taken something from inside him, and he'd decided not to notice the empty space, which was the most precise and most painful description I could have received. He didn't go to the garden. That was the detail that weighed most when I found out. Perhaps because the garden had been the only place in that mansion where the containment architecture we both carried loosened enough for real conversations to happen, and the idea that he'd closed that place after I left said something about the cost of what he'd done that no other information said the same way. Cora left tea on his office table every night without being asked, continuing a habit that had started when I was sick and that she'd simply maintained, as if some gestures, once established, had a life of their own, independent of the circumstances that had created them. Romolo never commented, but the tea disappeared every morning. The party was on a Saturday in August, a social event with a guest list long enough that any specific person's presence could be attributed to coincidence without the coincidence needing to be believed by anyone. I went because my professional schedule had crossed with the event for legitimate reasons completely independent of anything else, and I went in the black dress I reserved for occasions that needed elegant armor, which was a category that had grown considerably in the last 2 months. I didn't know he'd be there. I saw him first. He was on the other side of the ballroom in the dark suit as always, and with that posture that occupied space with an awareness I'd learned to recognize before processing. And around him was the same architecture of presence from the first days, the circle of respectful distance people maintained without being asked, the peripheral attention of the entire environment calibrated to where he was without anyone admitting to calibrating. I stopped in the middle of the ballroom with a glass in hand, and the party's noise continuing around me with the indifference environments have toward what's happening inside the people who inhabit them. And I looked at him with that attention I'd tried to unlearn for 2 months, and that was evidently intact, and with no intention of cooperating. He saw me a fraction of a second later. The minimal pause, almost imperceptible to anyone who hadn't spent weeks learning to read that specific face, and the quality of stillness that installed itself in him for that second, was different from the usual stillness, denser and more loaded, the kind that isn't rest but containment of something moving underneath. Neither of us moved for a moment that was longer than the ballroom deserved. I went to him. I'd always been braver than sensible recommended, and that night was no different. So I crossed the space between us with steps I kept regular by pure willpower, and stopped at a distance that was social without being cold, which was the most difficult balance I'd tried to maintain in a long time. Romolo, Sky, and my name in that voice, after 2 months, was physical information before being anything else, arriving at my chest with a force disproportionate to 2 syllables. Are you okay? Yes. You? No, I said, because lying to that man had stopped being an option I practiced, and because honesty had become between us a language I could no longer deactivate just because the context had changed. And there was a pause, very brief, the kind that contains a decision being made in real time. Before he answered. No, he said, with the same directness I'd used, and in that no was all the information I hadn't been able to stop wanting for the last 2 months. The air between us had that temperature whose texture I'd spent months trying to forget, and there was something in that no of his that was the most honest thing he'd given me since the office. Because in the office, there was the weight of the decision being made, and here there was nothing but the simple, bare fact itself. 2 months later, at an August party, he wasn't okay. And then Valentina appeared. She emerged from some point in my blind spot, with the precision of someone who knows the value of timing, and who'd waited for the exact moment, and her hand on his arm was a small, completely calculated gesture, the light pressure of fingers on the dark fabric of the suit with the naturalness of someone touching something that belongs to them, and who wants the entire ballroom to register exactly that. She looked at me with that smile from before, the teeth smile that didn't reach her eyes, and in it was the silent satisfaction of someone who believes they just won something. I looked at both hands, at her fingers on his arm, at the space between that image and the no he'd said 30 seconds before, and the geometry of the situation organized itself before me with a clarity I'd rather not have had at that specific moment, but that had arrived anyway. I took a step back. Good night, I said, and my voice came out exactly the way I needed it to, neutral and complete, and without any of the irregular edges I was holding underneath it. I turned. I crossed the ballroom with those regular steps I'd practiced leaving his office 2 months before, and left the party 10 minutes later with my bag on my shoulder, and the August air on my face, and the cold clarity of someone who just received information they hadn't asked for, but that arrived anyway. My father called at 11 at night. I was on the balcony with the 3 pots and the air that didn't cool completely even after midnight, and I answered with the voice of someone who'd been awake for hours and wasn't going to pretend they weren't. Sky. His voice was different, more tense and more resolved at the same time, with the specific quality of someone who made a decision and is calling before changing their mind. Dad, what is it? I did something tonight. A short pause. I went to talk to him. I went absolutely still on the balcony. To Romolo Castelli, he said, before I needed to ask. The silence that came from me was long enough for him to continue. There was something I needed to say that I kept for too long. His voice was low now, with the quality of confession that isn't weakness, but costs, the same way. The story Dom Ettore told his son about me is a lie. Romolo's uncle and I were partners, and what happened wasn't my betrayal. It was Dom Ettore's setup to eliminate his own brother and take his share of the business. I was used as an alibi, a breath. I kept documents all these years out of fear. I stayed quiet because I stayed quiet, which is the most honest and most cowardly explanation I have. I was standing on the balcony now, without having noticed I'd gotten up, with my hand on the railing and my eyes on the dark garden below. Why now? I asked when I found my voice. The pause that came before the answer had inside it the weight of a decision made with clarity and without regret. And when he spoke, there was in that voice something I recognized as the maximum expression of love my father was capable of showing, not in the form of a declaration, but in the form of costly action taken at the right moment. Because I saw my daughter leave that party with that look on her face, he said simply, and because he deserves to know he was lied to. About me. A pause. was. And about you. I stayed on the balcony for a long time after hanging up, with the phone in my hand and the August air around me, and the rosebush in the middle pot with the smell I'd learned not to compare to anything but that I compared to everything anyway, and thought about my father arriving to Romolo that night with 11 years of documents and silence, and about what that truth would do to the entire story that had been told to him from the beginning. I thought about how much of what had happened between us had been built on a lie neither of us had told. I went inside, closed the balcony door, went to bed and lay on my back staring at the ceiling with that steady rhythm of a mind that works when you'd rather at rest, and for the first time in 2 months, what I felt in the center of my chest wasn't just the weight of what had ended, it was something different, smaller and more alive, the kind that appears when a door you'd considered closed shows, through a minimal crack, that maybe it wasn't locked. It wasn't certainty. It wasn't peace. But it was hope's neighbor, and sometimes the neighbor is enough for one night. Chapter 9. The Truth, the Question, and Their Garden. The sun was going down when I arrived at the mansion. I didn't warn him I was coming. That decision was made on my apartment balcony with the 3 pots and with the rose bush in the middle, reminding me every morning that there were things I'd left unfinished, conversations that had been left half done, truths that deserved to be said face to face and not by message or through intermediaries or through any of the cowardly forms distance offers when you're afraid. Cora opened the door with that expression of hers that wasn't surprise, but also wasn't indifference, something in between that only she could do with precision, and let me in without asking anything because Cora never asked what she already knew. "He's in the garden," she said simply. I crossed the house with steps I still knew by heart, 18 to the stairs, 12 to the hallway, and then the glass door that led to the place I'd learned to call ours without having received formal permission for it. He was standing near the fountain, with his back to me, hands in his pockets, and face turned toward the east corner where the plant from the botany book still grew, and there was something in the image of him alone in that garden that reached my chest before any words. The specific loneliness of someone in a place that was shared, and that's now just his again. My footsteps on the stone path made him turn, and when our eyes met, there was no coldness or calculation, or any of the layers he used with the rest of the world. It was just Romolo looking at me with that intensity I'd learned to recognize as the most honest version of him, when there was no time to build anything on top. Sky. My name in that voice was confirmation that 2 months hadn't changed absolutely anything that mattered. My father told me. I went straight, because it was what he deserved. What you did. The conversation with your father. The truth. He didn't answer immediately, just looked at me with that complete attention that always disarmed me, as if each word I said deserved to be weighed before any response. "I should have looked for you sooner," he said finally. "I should have. You're here now." I went to him, stopped close enough to feel the heat radiating from him, to see the marks of exhaustion around his eyes that weren't there before, and reached out my hand to touch his chest, just touch, feel his heart beating underneath the dark suit with that rhythm that was slightly faster than it should be. "You sent me away to protect me. It wasn't a question." "Yes." "And spent 2 months thinking you'd done the right thing." "No." And there was in that word a brutal honesty that only he could deliver like that without preparation. "I spent 2 months knowing I'd done wrong and trying to convince myself otherwise." Something inside me came completely undone. His hand found my face with that delicacy that didn't match the things those hands did in his world, and I closed my eyes just feeling, letting that touch be what it was, without trying to translate it into words that would be insufficient anyway. "I love you, Sky Harding." Quietly. Like confession, like surrender. And I don't know if that's good for you, but it's true. I opened my eyes. He was there, completely exposed in a way I knew cost everything for that specific man, waiting for my answer with a vulnerability I'd never seen in anyone before. "Then, give me a chance to find out if it's good," I said. "Stop this thing of deciding for me what's best. I choose Romolo, and I choose you." When he kissed me, it was with an urgency that had months of absence inside it. Hands on my face, and then on my nape, and then on my back, pulling me close as if distance were the most intolerable thing in the world. I responded with the same intensity, with months of longing and anger and love that I'd tried to convince myself could be smaller, but that was exactly the size it had always been. When we separated, we stayed with foreheads touching, breathing the same air, with the sound of the fountain in the background, and the setting sun over the rose bushes creating that golden light that made everything more cinematic than real life had a right to be. "Marry me," he said, without warning. Without preparation, just saying it because he'd reached the point where holding back didn't make sense anymore. "Are you asking or ordering?" The smallest smile I'd ever seen on him appeared, complete and devastating. Asking, for the first time in my life. Yes, simple, definitive, true. He kissed my forehead, my nose, my lips again, more calmly this time, like someone who has time and intends to use it all. I stayed with my head on his chest, listening to the heartbeat I'd learned to recognize in the dark, with the garden around us, and the fountain making its usual sound, and thought about everything that had been necessary to get here. A false debt that took me from the place where I was, a mansion that wasn't mine and that became so, a man I'd tried not to love with a dedication that, in retrospect, was almost funny. Fear, choices made before being certain, trust given before having proof. No part of the path had been what I would have planned if I could have planned it, and the garden had bloomed anyway. "Are you okay?" he said, with his voice low near my hair. I raised my face to look at him. "I am," I said. "For the first time in a long time, I am." Well, this is Lena, and I truly loved writing this story. But believe it or not, I'm not making a single cent from this book 1. That's why I created book 2, in video and super spicy. Access to it is paid for a very symbolic price. She'd said yes 10 minutes ago. The ring was still shining when a female silhouette appeared at the side entrance of the garden. And I knew, before any words, that this night wasn't over. Valentina Serra never showed up without a reason. The hand went to her belly slowly, deliberately. "I'm pregnant. 3 months. And the baby is yours." I searched for the lie in her eyes. What I found was worse. A calm certainty with no room for contestation. The problem? I couldn't deny it with absolute certainty. Because there was one night, too many drinks, and I woke up in her bed with no memory of how I'd gotten there. Just the certainty that I had, and the shame of someone who knows exactly what that means. Sky was still inside, smiling, showing the ring she'd just received to the whole family. And I stood in the dark garden knowing that at some point, I'd need to walk through that door. Like I said, that was just a taste of book 2. To watch it uncensored, just click on the first link here in the pinned comment. I'll see you on the other side in a few seconds. Remember, just click on the first link down here in the comments, and book 2 complete. No ads, no interruptions, will already be available for you. It's very simple. Book 2 is something I'm loving making. You're loving it too, so I promise there will be more. It's where you find increasingly spicy stories, a true dark romance. And precisely because this version is getting more and more heated, the video isn't well accepted publicly on YouTube. This closed environment is where I can actually share my essence, and where I feel free to do my best work for you. More news coming soon. I'll be waiting for you on the other side.